time and or abduction by any other person. And Section 15 make reference to the protection against sexual exploitation or use during prostitution. I know during the COVID and even in some of the places, some of our towns, this tends to happen. Or an inducement or coercion to engage in any sexual activity that or exposure to obscene materials. I think we have many of these in like the pornographic materials that sometimes are being sold out, or they just the children themselves being exposed to. And governing us is a Act 2003, Section 21 and Section 38, that a public officer shall not sexually harass a member of the public. This including making request of exacting no pressure of sexual activity or any favors that there may be. And 38 provides that if following an investigation of act of the commission is of the view that the civil or the criminal proceedings ought to be considered, then the commission here may refer the matter to the AG or any other appropriate authority. Move on to the next. And just going along is the issue of the transactional sex, a few of the definitions that some may be familiar with: the exchange of money and solicitation of transactional sex, that is a request for the transactional sex, and exploitative relationship, sexual assault, the sexual activity with a minor, and rape that have been defined here. And minor here, of course, we look at the age that has been given, of younger than 18 years old, 18 years of age. So it's not about them saying, or in this case, either the young man, the girl saying that I'm 18 and yet she's underage, or the person feeling that that person looked older and therefore she could be or he could be above 18. So any mistaken belief as to the age of the child is no defense. Next. We move on to next. Okay, fine, thanks. And just looking again in terms of the continuing that section 21, a public officer is prohibited, or rather say that no sexual harassment shall not sexually harass. I think we're just going to continue from the previous one. And here the harassment is the three categories that we mentioned: making requests or exacting pressure, and then 3, intentional or careless physical contact that is of sexual in nature. And 3 is the gestures, the noises, the jokes, and I think that sometimes happen a lot, and then including any innuendos or regarding another person's sexuality. I think there are various hashtags that we captured here in the infographic that we have. We've seen some of these in the media or the social platform that we do interact with. Next. The Constitution, yes, of Kenya also have got the protecting us, that every person has an inherent dignity and the right to have that dignity respected. And to Article 29C, every person has the right to the freedom and security of that person, which includes the right not to be subjected to any form of violence. And looking at employment, which I believe many of us were engaged, the Act 2207 states that a worker is harassed sexually if the employer or its representative or a co-worker requests directly or indirectly for any form of sexual favor in order to get a preferential treatment. We also underline here that a representative, so it could be under that means that person could be a co-worker, could be somebody who's reporting to be an employee from, maybe it's from a hospital, or from the government, whichever department, requests for any form of sexual favor. I think we have already highlighted this in the previous slide. We'll just proceed to the next. And some of the examples that you do have. This is an attempt or the actual sexual assault, sharing or displaying any sexually inappropriate images or videos in any format, or sending sexual or suggestive communications in any format as well, or any anecdotes or jokes. Sorry.
Dan, we lost you there for a minute.
Sorry. Yeah, I think it was just a little network. Unwelcome touching, as mentioned, pitching, patting, rubbing, or brushing against others. I think this sometimes being seen especially in crowded places, or as it were in the previous times when we used to have these buses which are congested, overloaded, or people standing. And I think there used to be a bit of these reports, or staring in a sexually suggestive manner, and repeatedly asking a person for dates, or asking for sex, putting pressure, or rating a person's sexuality. So these have been considered as sexual harassment. The comments that are being made, name calling, the slurs, sexual connotation, making derogatory or demeaning comments on someone's. I think this we used to see sometimes, and must say that we could have observed this even so many years ago. Probably, maybe we were not exposed to in terms of recognition of this in some of the lectures, or among some of the teachers, or some of the teachers, yes, or lecturers, having such kind of behaviors before. So this could, at that particular time, we think we could have taken them up. The next one, I think this is just trying to define, trying to make, see the difference in simple terms, sexual exploitation and abuse, looking at this occurs against a beneficiary or a member or a vulnerable member of that community, whoever is considered as vulnerable. So issues of having power above the other person, and harassment in terms differential powers that you mentioned, and the GBV. This is any violence. So the exploitation and abuse are considered as form of GBV. And taking note that, and this we had a direct experience last week. We were doing this training in some of the counties, and some people look at sexual harassment as just at a workplace, but it goes even beyond the workplace, even at the community level. That's where some of us interact. So we look at it between the male, the female, the workplace, or the exploitation can even be beyond the workplace at a community level when you're probably conducting a service, and people will look at you. Maybe if at all, like giving an example, a doctor at even at a community level, or a nurse or a healthcare worker at that community level, you are considered at having a higher level, or even if you're a chief or assistant chief or the headman or whoever that person is. And this, whoever is receiving assistance at that community level. And I must also just say this, that it is something which is highly considered and taken seriously, especially in the UN, that even an implementing partner, for that matter, that whoever when we are supporting, like assuming we are, or like for example, not assuming, we are supporting the Ministry of Health, and we've gone for a workshop, and maybe that workshop somebody reports having been abused sexually. The Ministry of Health or that county or that implementing partner will be held responsible. And that sometimes can mean termination of even of the contract or that support. So each one of us needs to take it seriously. I think that marks the end for me for now, then hand over to Nyambura, and I think we'll also liaise with Kongesh as mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. There is a question about clarity about what do we mean when we say gestures, innuendos about a person's sexuality, and what it really means in the law. And so the question is, can we provide examples of that? I think Dan clearly referenced the Kenyan law and what it says about what constitutes sexual harassment. And I believe the Public Officer Ethics Act of 2003, Section 21, clearly says that they don't necessarily give examples, but if we were to take the meaning of sexual harassment as we understand it and define it in the UN, where we define it as unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature that might reasonably be expected or be perceived to cause offense or humiliation. When such conduct interferes with work, or it is made a condition of employment, or it creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So maybe what we want to emphasize there is it's unwelcome conduct. So while the perpetrator may argue that, well, I did not mean any offense, well, he or she is a little too sensitive, that's not how I meant it. If it's unwelcome, by the recipient, by the person to whom you're directing these gestures and innuendos. For instance, commenting about, oh, are you gay? Are you lesbian? Or you look so butch, maybe you're gay. That could constitute sexual harassment if it is unwelcome and if it causes offense or humiliation to the person who is the recipient of those remarks. So I hope that explains it. And I believe the Kenyan law is guided also by international best practice because the Public Officers Ethics Act does say, it's not just limited to exerting pressure for sexual activity or physical contact of a sexual nature. It's jokes, it's noises, etc. There's another question. Dan, do you want to weigh in on that as well?
Nyambura.
Yes.
Sorry, Nyambura.
Yes?
If it's okay, could we finish all the presentations and then we can do the question
Come back
and
to this
answer
question.
afterwards? Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Yeah, because I think they're coming fast and furious. So, okay.
Yes.
All right. So what I'm going to discuss is how then do you respond? How then do you respond to sexual exploitation and abuse? How then do you respond to sexual harassment? And I want to particularly reference sexual harassment. And what I'm going to look at is how do we develop policies, effective policies that are victim-centered and that enable us to provide the best response to exploitation, to abuse and harassment. Now, there are people who will say that, you're exaggerating. It's not such a big deal. People are just sensitive these days. Long time we used to say these things. It wasn't such a big deal. What's up with everybody? But sexual harassment and by extension, exploitation and abuse is harmful for your organization. And I think the Employment Act envisaged that, and so talks about, if you recall, Dan talked about if a representative of your company is using the umbrella of your organization to perpetrate sexual harassment or exploit beneficiaries of maybe the work you're doing in communities or your clients, etc. it harms your organization. It gives the impression that that's your organization's MO. That's how you operate. So it's incompatible with any organization's mission. Nobody wants to be associated or thought of as, oh yeah, that's the company where, there are a bunch of sexual harassers, or they go into a community, perhaps they've been asked to build roads or something, and they abuse minors, they leave children in their wake, and they refuse to take responsibility, etc., etc. It ultimately inhibits your organizational objectives. Nobody feels safe. Nobody feels safe coming, for instance, if it's a health facility, to an institution where there are questions about people's safety, men and women's safety. Am I safe engaging with that organization or seeking services? It undermines educational outcomes. I think in this case, especially when we think about schools, when we think about university settings, remember the whole hue and cry about the sex for marks, which really, if we were to put a name to it, was about sexual harassment. And I think it should have been addressed in that context. So ultimately, you begin questioning the people who went through the university at that time. Did they really get those marks? So it's not something that an institution wants to sweep under the rug and ignore. And I think we all have a responsibility as members of institutions, members of organizations, to address it. Now, for the UN and for UN Women, at the height of the Me Too hashtags and campaigns and the follow-up all across the world, including in our own country, the hue and cry there was about sexual harassment, whether it was in the workplace, in the streets, public transport. We did a lot of reflection on what constitutes an effective sexual harassment policy and procedure. What are some building blocks? And one of the first ones is the policy. You have to define sexual harassment for what it is, that it is a human rights violation of gender-based discrimination, regardless of sex. So you can have sexual harassment, exploitation, abuse, where it is men doing it to other men, women doing it to other women. It is a human rights violation. So that's a starting point, understanding that it is a violation. It is not something small. It has huge ramifications for the mental well-being of victims, and ultimately, as we've said, even for the organization's reputation. And when you define sexual harassment, you also need to look at how it intersects, how it connects with other social inequalities. So, for instance, are you more likely to be sexually harassed if, say, you're young and you're working in an institution where the vast majority of people are old? So there are dynamics there that perhaps increase the vulnerability of people. Is it also likely that if you're disabled, that you're likely to be preyed upon? If you're poor, if you turn up at a health center and you don't have money maybe to pay for a service that requires you to pay, are you more likely to, for instance, be a victim of not only sexual harassment, but exploitation and abuse? I will serve you if you sleep with me. Are you more likely if you're from a lower income bracket? You need to recognize also that sexual harassment is unwelcome conduct in the world of work. That has to be very upfront, that it is not something that you condone as an institution, and that it is unwelcome. And here I want to clarify that we are not talking about consent. We are saying that the standard term that you want to use in your policy is that it is unwelcome conduct. The reason why consent becomes a dicey word here is because we know that where there's power differentials, somebody will say yes. They find the request for a sexual favor to be unwelcome, but because of the difference in power, because of the vulnerabilities that I have mentioned before, they consent. And if you are to then say that, well, the person consented, therefore it was okay, you would be doing an injustice to a survivor. And that we want then to look at the issue of, was it unwelcome? the person. And we've seen cases even in the Kenyan context where the law, and this is something actually to clarify, that while for the UN the defense of, well, I thought she was over 18, or I thought he was over 18, is not allowed. Actually, unfortunately, under the Sexual Offences Act in Kenya, and it's one of the things that I believe women's rights organizations and others are working to change, is you can use that as a defense in the Kenyan situation, which is really problematic, because if I look 18 and I'm 13, does that mean that the perpetrator gets away with it? So in our own law, there are gaps that need to be addressed. The other elements are around procedure. So we know that our institutions, and we've seen institutions run to put in place sexual harassment policies. And I don't know, if I asked the people on the call, all 574 of you, how many of you are familiar with your institution's sexual harassment policy? And not just the policy, but also that if you filed a sexual harassment complaint, are you familiar with the procedure for like what procedure would be followed if you file a complaint? Do you know what to expect? Many of us will say, yeah, kind of, not too sure. And this is why there are some basics that we were saying for institutions to consider as they put in place their sexual harassment policies and their policies on exploitation and abuse. You need to have clearly defined that there'll be equality between the parties. So procedures are equally available to the accused and the accuser. And that the jurisdiction extends to everyone. So those who can be sexually harassed, or who can sexually harass. And this is important because sometimes the policies and even the procedures can tend to favor perpetrators, especially if it's perpetrators who are in positions of relative power. Especially as we saw, for instance, in the UN, when you had the head of a UN agency who then was accused of covering up for his fellow leader in the organization. And that system did not work for the victim, and that's why for us we're saying that if you're going to put in place a policy, look at it so that it's protecting those who are likely or can be sexually harassed and those who could perpetrate sexual harassment. Statutes of limitations, those need to be realistic. We know that a lot of times victims of sexual violence will not come right out and report. You're fearful for your job, so you keep quiet. Beneficiaries of our support, whether that's a patient, may also be a bit quiet. So you should not say, well, if you didn't report in 2 hours, then sorry, can't help you. So think about the statutes of limitations. Investigations need to be independent of those who are in power, the institutional structures of power. So if the CEO's office should not interfere. A manager's office should not interfere with investigations. In the UN, we have a whole separate office for internal oversight services, OIOS, which provides a completely independent service to UN agencies that are investigating issues of fraud, issues of sexual exploitation and abuse. Now, remember I asked, how many of us know the procedures? We need clear, simple, easy to understand procedures for us as the employees and employers, but also for our clients. If I come to a hospital and I experience sexual harassment, I should be able to know as a patient, where do I report? What can I reasonably expect will happen within this period of time? But if it's a long-winded process, it's bureaucratic, I'm unlikely to follow it up. In the interim, especially where sexual harassment has happened, a colleague has come out with a complaint, you need to have measures in place for how do those two continue working. One of the things the UN was criticized for in some of our incidents of sexual harassment being reported was rather than the victims were told sometimes to just go and leave. The perpetrator continued on the job as the investigation happened, rather than trying to see how do you protect the victim as well. So the victim-centered approach, a prompt process. Don't make it never ending. Let it be prompt, let it be clear. as a form of accountability, and I think this is especially important for those of us working in the health sector, who are the public-facing part of the health sector, nurses, doctors, all sorts of especially where it's public, civil servants. Let's also get into the culture of report. Let's say we received X number of cases and this is how we addressed them. Building protection against retaliation. Too often what we see is people report and then somehow the information gets out and then the victim you start experiencing retaliation. Your contract is not renewed. If it's for exploitation and abuse, where perhaps I, as a person in power, have abused a beneficiary of, say, the support that the UN is providing, I start intimidating that community. Oh, you're not going to get support. You're not going to get, we're not going to come and do projects in your area. So there has to be protection for retaliation. I think where number 15 is really talking about where sometimes we decide our policy shall have formal and informal procedures. I think it's important that those who use the procedures know when can I shift from informal. So maybe I'm experiencing sexual harassment and I bring it to my manager and I say, this is now a problem. When do I bring it and turn it to, when can I say, okay, I'm not happy with how the informal process is going on. I would like it now to be formal. I would like to file a formal complaint. Let it be clear. Confidentiality, very important, but too often we use it also as a barrier to redress. And that I think needs to be, there needs to be a balance. The criminal concepts are not to be employed. In a lot of cases, sexual harassment is also dealt with in civil court. So you also want to look at to what extent are you are you allowing for the procedures around civil matters to prevail. Sanctions, what sanctions will you have? How will they be determined? The severity of the behavior. Make sure you have trained people so that when complaints are received, it's not maybe Nyabura, she's not trained, so she receives a complaint and she's like, now who do I call? And the victim is expecting me to know the procedure and take them through it, to walk them through it. And you bungle cases like that, and it really calls into question an organization's commitment. Hearings should be for both sides. I think make it possible for all to hear. Things like non-disclosure agreements. Now, because sometimes people take an informal route of resolution, we have to be careful though that where non-disclosure agreements could say the matter has been settled, we don't speak of it again. But where there are repeated cases and of violence and where it is and where it's violent abuse, I think the proposal here is that your policy should also have a caveat that yes, non-disclosure agreements are okay, but ultimately where we fear that this person will go on to repeat this maybe in another organization, the non-disclosure agreement does not hold. So if the person maybe goes to another organization, they seek a reference from you, you should be allowed to share that, this is why we let this person go, especially where the person was violent. And finally, I think when you're thinking about your policy, think about the culture. Policies will only be effective, procedures will only be effective if there is leadership buy-in to all aspects. So to the independence of the procedure, to making sure people are trained and able to respond. Also advancing women to positions of power so that they're also able to use that platform to hold accountable and to push norms that support equality, rather than having an institution that is so male dominated, it's so hierarchical that even in terms of the norms and who can speak, how a matter is resolved, that it makes it not conducive for really creating a safe environment for everyone. And then be transparent, accountable. Don't hide. As an institution, your first reaction should not be, oh my goodness, let's deny. It's the default sometimes is to say we don't know anything about it. That person made it up. it doesn't help the case. As I said, sexual harassment, allegations of exploitation and abuse are extremely damaging to your brand, to the trust that has been entrusted to you. So this is just a quote that really sums up that sexual harassment is about power. It's about the imbalance of power, and sadly and truthfully, it is also about the male-dominated culture that we see in a lot of institutions, and not just government but private sector, international organizations. The UN is not immune, and even within civil society. If you recall, there was a lot of revelations as during the height of the Me Too campaigns and all that, that, even within civil society, within NGOs that should be helping, that sexual harassment was rife, and that there was a culture of using power to silence and to hide. So as you do your policy, just remember, be guided by this. Professor Mackinnon is an expert on sexual harassment. She's a legal expert on this, and this quote, I think, for me, should guide any institution that wants to prepare a policy. That power is being believed, no matter how little sense you make and how little evidence you have. Powerlessness is not being believed, no matter how much evidence you have and how much sense you make. And this really encapsulates a situation for a lot of victims of sexual harassment, of exploitation, of sexual abuse, that they are not believed, despite bringing a mountain of evidence. Yeah. There it is. There's still this disbelief that, no, I don't think it happened. The burden of proof is so much on victims that it makes it almost impossible to find redress for them, even when they're saying what they're saying makes so much sense. But because we see them as poor, they're less educated, they're women, or they're people with disabilities, or they're sexual minorities, we don't believe them. And you want a policy that will believe you despite not having as much evidence. We'll give you that benefit of the doubt. Let me end by discussing the issue, some other practical steps that I think can be taken. Training, there's a whole school of thought there that it needs to be more than something we tick the box. So for instance, at the UN, upon entry, whether you're a consultant, a staff member, you must complete mandatory training. This is provided online, but also it's provided face to face. But after that, again, people just revert to type. So training also has to be about challenging the culture within your institution. So developing training material that challenges. Why would you not speak out if you saw your colleague perpetrating sexual exploitation and abuse? You've gone out into the field, you've seen your colleague doing this. Why would you not speak up? So training has to chip away at some of the deeply, deeply held ways of thinking that allow sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment to thrive. Victim-focused work. So even as you develop your policy, even as you develop programs to support victims, put their needs first. Put yourselves in their shoes. What do victims need? When I report as a victim of sexual harassment, do I want to keep working next to the alleged perpetrator? Does the policy center my needs, or does it look at the perpetrator and center their needs? Making reporting rational. I think I touched on this already. Zero tolerance. I think the way we see in government buildings, we have signs that say this is a corruption-free zone. I think we need to send out that message very clearly. Posters all over in public areas in our institutions where we say zero tolerance, both in principle and in practice. And also never do nothing. I think zero tolerance means that even a rumor If you hear a rumor that, I sent out a team to do some work in the field, maybe they're doing vaccinations, then I hear that, oh, maybe there was some sexual exploitation and abuse that happened, deal with it. I think as managers, deal with it. Don't sort of be like, yeah, maybe it's just a rumor. It will die down. Zero tolerance is picking up some of those claims, all the claims you hear, and investigating them fully. That sends a very strong message that in our organization, we do not condone these acts. And collective ownership. Ultimately, we expect our managers to lead, but we are the individuals that work in these institutions. We're the individuals that go out to communities to serve them. We also have a certain responsibility. And I think a policy also should emphasize that, what's your responsibility? As a bystander, what's your responsibility? How do you intervene? How do you support our safe work environment? You hear somebody sending jokes on the group, on different WhatsApp groups for work, and some of the jokes are lewd or offensive. Do you speak up, or do you say, well, not my problem? So I think this last point is important because it all starts with us and with us as individuals. So I'm going to stop it there and look forward to engaging with you all. Over.
Thank you very much, Nyambura, for such an interesting and very welcome discussion. I'll start with asking a few questions. There's a question here. I am a male consultant, obstetric and gynecologist practicing in Nairobi. The law requires that anytime we medically examine our clients, there should be a female chaperone. Often some clients repeatedly make comments like like your nipples are retracted, you need to roll them repeatedly for eventual effective breastfeeding. You get comments like your girlfriends. Will this be a form of sexual harassment?
Often some clients repeatedly make comments.
Yeah, so basically this is an obstetrician. He's doing an examination on his patient, and then sometimes they have to examine the breast area, especially the nipple area. Then they make a comment like probably the patient is the one who's making a comment like, oh, you like your girlfriend or something. So they're asking, is that a form of sexual harassment?
I think if it makes you uncomfortable, remember we talked about it's unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. You are reasonably offended. I would classify that as sexual harassment. Because if I am offended by those sort of remarks, and I know maybe somebody will say, yeah, but doctors need to have thick skins. No. No.
Yeah,
because I'm somebody
we're
say, but
humans.
that's, yeah, you're human. For us, I'll say that the definition is it's unwelcome. It's unwelcome conduct, gestures, remarks. I feel offended by that remark. Here I am trying to give you medical advice, and your remark has just taken this to a whole other. It's made it sexual, and I'm uncomfortable with that. So that is a form of sexual harassment. And to clarify that it can go both ways. Your client can also, remember we talked about it's happening in the workplace, and again, it's this culture we have, and it's not just a Kenyan thing where we're free and easy with some things. And I think people just need to dial back. There are boundaries. Yeah, there are boundaries.
Yeah. And I believe the way you answered it is very, very correct. It's unwelcomed, not necessarily just consensual, because you can give a consent, especially when you're in authoritative position. Yeah. Yes, Okoro. Dan?
Now, just emphasizing the same fact that that it is quite derogatory. I think one should be careful on the statements that we make often, even as doctors or as healthcare workers to the clients. Sometimes we may think that we are making it as a joke, but it actually harasses the clients.
So maybe a question is this part of the training? Because there's a lot of questions here regarding I believe, government offices, not just MOH or anything. Do we have inductions, or can we start such induction process, because emphasizing a lot on sexual harassment?
I would say you should consider that as standard part of induction, and I think it's something that MOH could roll out, and you standardize. You standardize the definitions. You standardize procedure. You know, people. So once you standardize, I think it helps people know what to expect. If my manager is harassing me, where do I go? You see, and it should ideally be part of the induction. So in a way, you're translating the Public Officers Ethics Act into practice by bringing it now to your level. For instance, that doctor would now have a recourse should say this client persists in making these remarks. He or she would be able to say, you know what, I don't want to see that client, or they would take it up more formally. But without that induction and an understanding of the procedures, there is room for a lot of ambiguity and abuse to continue in silence, which is not what you want. You want an environment where everyone feels safe to come to work. Yeah. And there are examples. There, like the UN has courses, very simple courses that can, in fact, we do them online. Now that everything is going online.
Free.
Yeah, they are. They are actually, I believe, for even our implementing part, anybody can actually access them. We did this even for those who provide, for instance, cafeteria services. They were able to do their course if they wanted. It's all available. It's free. It's online. So it could be something that perhaps we take forward in a further conversation as to how to do this sort of induction.
Thank you. Thank you. So another controversial question is, dress code is a focal point that ignites most of sexual harassment in any professional field. Why should one complain of harassment, yet they do trigger the violation across the two gender?
Did I get that?
Dan, do you want to start with that?
I dress my choice, huh?
Okay. So did I get a question?
Did you get the answer? Did you get the question correctly? Basically, the questionnaire is asking, if somebody is dressing inappropriately, why should they complain of sexual harassment?
I think one of the, I think that's probably giving an excuse in that case. But what we need to have self-control, because somebody having dressed in a way that you think that you, in your own judgment, because you are the one who has made that judgment that it is suggestive, but that's not true. The person has dressed the way she thinks she needs to dress. And because I want to give an example, maybe you excuse me on this, is that we see many, even in culture, even when you go to some of the communities, they're dressed differently. Why are they not being looked at in a manner that's suggestive? So this is an area where one just wants to give an excuse, and it's not allowed.
Okay. We have been joined by Dr. Rose Wafula, the program manager of SRH. Kindly make a comment. Rose Wafula.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
And for joining in late. I think I want to agree with the comment made by Dan, that I think one of the lessons we must adapt and accept when it comes to sexual harassment, it has nothing to do with the victim or the person who that violence is being meted on. And it always has to be for us to look at the perpetrator. And the issue of dress code often has been used just as an excuse, but it has really nothing to do with the victim. So dress code is never an excuse, or the way somebody was talking or behaving, just like the question that was there about a child and their behavior in going to somebody's room. So we need to be very careful, and it needs to be a message out there that no manner of behavior should be used as an excuse, whether dressing, talking, as an excuse to explain violence. or harassment of anyone sexually. I think there was a question around, and I know often people say, is there any government induction on sexual harassment in the workplace? Perhaps this is something that we can work on and improving, because the Public Ethics Act is very clear around the issue of workplace sexual harassment. But maybe the induction process, if I remember very well as an intern, there's so much that is covered that sometimes this area that so often accompanies both male and female in the workplace is maybe overlooked or rushed upon. So my take from the questions and what is coming up is that this is an area that beyond the initial inductions, there should be follow-up support in the workplace, even as people practice, so that it is embedded in the culture of the day-to-day practice, kind of similar to some refreshers on this thematic area.
Dr. Maybe you can address the issue of nipple examination. Professor Lema would like an expansion on that discussion.
Sorry. What was the issue on the nipple?
During an examination, let's say you're a male, you're examining the female, and you want to examine further, and they start making sexual suggestive comments like your girlfriend and what have you. How are you supposed to look at that?
I think I came in when you're answering that, and I think one of the things that we must also recognize is that even as healthcare workers, we would be subjected to sexual harassment, and we should recognize as it is and not try to pass over it. I think one of the critical things when it comes to examining persons of the opposite gender, and not just in the workplace, in the hospitals as medical practitioners, but also in other sectors, is to align to what is provided to reduce the opportunities for that. So the issue of chaperones, I doubt that in the context of having chaperones in that space I believe would make a big difference in limiting such comments. But even in the event of that, part of the training and support that we need to give our healthcare workers, including doctors, is the capacity and skill, and the capacity and skill to speak up in a manner that is very clear on setting the boundaries with their clients, that this is unwelcome, this is unacceptable, so that the client knows clearly. There is don't fear, because you have a right to explain to the client that this is wrong and this is unacceptable and this is a line that you are not willing that it continues. So my take is that the answer was actually appropriate, and I don't know whether I think it's us to rise up and not feel like it's unprofessional to tell off a client that this is unacceptable.
Nice, thank you very much. So I think this is a question which a lot of people have to ask. So you file in a complaint and the court needs evidence. What happens? You know, what's the normal, as opposed to what should happen, what's happening on the ground? Are people having successful litigations and what have you?
Yes, yeah, there are instances, and we can pull out those. There are instances. What I'm not as privy to is how many. I think somebody asked about I think there's a very good question related to that. You know, what's the existing jurisprudence on sexual harassment, especially in surgery, gynecology, obstetrics? I think the most famous case was the one of the fake doctor who was actually, perpetrating sexual abuse on his clients. That, I think, really shone a light on this. But I think what was raised earlier about the gray line that also that happens when clients are harassing medical staff raises the issue of the need for clarity, legal clarity on this issue. And I think what I have seen mostly is sexual harassment cases, not necessarily in medical settings. And I think that's an area that is quite gray. And that's why, in my opinion, policies, induction, as was said, specific induction on this issue, to iron out the potential scenarios that you're likely to encounter as a medical officer that may not necessarily be the same scenarios that I encounter as a UN worker, or as maybe I work in a factory or a flower farm. So I think there is need for very context-specific induction to understand even how you're protected legally if somebody were to claim that you've sexually harassed them in the course of what you consider a routine exam. You know, what happens then? So I think a policy, clarity on what the policies are is very important in this case. I saw quite a few questions on what is the policy, what is the policy, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to give this an opportunity to Dr. Makanyeko. Daktari, are you able to hear us? Okay, maybe Daktari can join in later. There was a question somebody was asking regarding, yeah, most of the institutions have soft policy, but physically the victims cannot feel the impact of the assistance from the provided policy. So they're asking, how can one get assistance in case the organization is not addressing the matter with the weight it deserves? I don't know if you understand, but okay, like I work in an organization, there are policies, but they're not acting on it. Where should I go and report it? Is there somewhere specific that I can go and report in my employer or something?
Dan, do you want to pick on that?
Yeah. Okay. One is just issue of the soft policies. Yes, we have policies which do exist, especially in looking at the civil service. However, many people are not aware. Many people are not brought. It's not brought to attention of people, and in any case, probably just exists as a policy within the larger framework. But now they need to increase the awareness and be explicit about the policies and pick out. Like now we're talking about the sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. Pick it out and have a reporting mechanism. And the reporting mechanism, as somebody probably highlighted, I think in one of the comments here, is that some of these people are the bosses, maybe could be the MESU, could be the manager. Usually it's not the CEO of the organization. So it's independent of that. And of course, what happens is expected that even the CEO to exercise that accountability to ensure that the employees or the staff are well versed with and also protecting or preventing sexual exploitation or sexual abuse. Now, one is not so, because it is just, as we mentioned, it's against the laws of the country. So it can go beyond the institution should this be not addressed at the institutional level. So one can go beyond because it's enshrined in the law, and therefore one can go beyond the institution should you not be satisfied with the actions being taken at that particular point.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, kindly.
That's why we had, if you remember, we establishment of the gender-based violence centers, the GBV centers, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
They were, the reason for the GBV centers is that so that such people who were not able to report or were not getting support from the institutions, they could actually approach the GBV centers or even the gender desks in police stations, but many people complain about the police stations, but the GBV centers were supposed to be quite, receptive, private, so that in these centers, the police can be called in. And I know in Kenyatta, when I was there, I retired in 2019, we would call the police from the post and they would come and record some statements. The social worker would do their reports. And we did a lot of the documentation there and then handed over to our partners, some of whom, for example, was Koval and FIDA, among others. And they would actually help assist this person. The only problem if he's an employee, then chances are, and that's your boss, you may lose your job. It's quite tricky, yeah? But basically, those were avenues where such people could report. And we had some success stories, and of course, some were challenging.
Sorry, I like the fact that you mentioned it's a gender-based violence center, but okay, like sexual harassment, just unwelcome comments and what have you. Do people actually go to such centers to make such reports? Is there like a forum for that?
No, normally people tolerate and they suffer, but it reaches a point that it starts traumatizing you such that you can't function, and that's when now they come. So there are no other places that I know apart from just the GBV centers, but most organizations have very clear policies of not allowing such sexual harassment, so it's just unfortunate that some organizations do not act on such cases. That's unfortunate.
Yeah, and you mentioned about the police station. I found it very nice that they went out of their way to make sure that women are the key contact for GBV, such
Yes.
to make it a bit more suitable for people. It was even easier for me to report cases or forward cases or link up people because it's a woman, they have a softer approach, it's easier to deal with them. And I'm sure not a lot of people are aware that the police officers have actually done that.
Yeah, there's some very nice police gender desks. I have come across some nice, well-trained, policemen in some office, but I've heard of complaints. Now we have an issue with the men. There are a number of men who are sexually harassed and even raped, boys and men, and they just don't have anywhere to go because they feel shame and people will just laugh at them, and they are so quite a number. And they're so traumatized over years. So again, I raised that question on Q&A. I don't know your experiences on that, but it's an area we have to really also look at. So we can't just have female, maybe they would open up to a male who is more receptive on the police desk. Yeah.
I believe that's a key talk, and of late we're seeing a lot of cases for men who are violated sexually, and unfortunately theirs is even more traumatizing because they have foreign objects, they go to surgery and what have you, and still their main complaints when they come to hospital is abdominal pain, not sexual abuse. So thank you very much for that. It's good we talk about the men, not just the women. I have a question. How about areas whereby they have a bromance culture, especially in areas of cells, whereby they promote male culture, like going out, drinking? It's really a sexually tensed. How do you deal with that?
I wouldn't know how to answer that one.
So do you mean like the work culture, that's the work culture?
Yeah, that's the work culture. Yeah.
I think the point we made earlier about I think Dan, when in his presentation, flagged, for instance, an instance where you are a bystander. So you perhaps take part in those, drink ups after work. But every so often you notice that lines are being crossed. Maybe you're serving in a small healthcare facility somewhere, and every so often you see a colleague sort of slide out and hang out with underage, with minors. I think again, really what I want to emphasize here is the organizational culture and how it is communicated, that it doesn't matter how far you're serving, you cannot engage in abusive or sexually exploitative behavior. And you as a colleague of the person who is perpetrating this also have an obligation. For us at the UN, if you suspect that a situation of sexual exploitation and abuse has occurred and you do not speak up, and an investigation eventually is done, and sexual exploitation and abuse is found to have occurred, and you're identified as having witnessed it and said nothing, you are also held liable. So the culture is one of zero tolerance. So as a bystander, if you suspect, there are channels to raise it. So that's for within the institution of the UN, being able to raise it, even with the suspicion of, I think it may have happened. I'm not too sure if what I saw was it. Raise it so that it can, they don't immediately, again, going back to the issue of a policy and procedure, you don't just immediately assign guilt. You'll do investigations, you'll try and corroborate some of this evidence before arriving at a conclusion. In the absence of clear procedures, then those sorts of things will happen. And there is no person being held accountable. The culture of the mix of alcohol, hanging out after work is a very potent mix, but it is no excuse. It's not an excuse for sexual harassment. So yes, I can agree to go out for a drink with my colleague, but if it crosses, if he or she then is making remarks or tries to attack me, I have not consented, I find it offensive, it's unwelcome conduct, then that is problematic. And it doesn't matter whether we're having alcohol or we were out in the club, the fact that it's unwelcome conduct is problematic. And I know we'll get comments like, well, some people bring it on themselves. I think that has already been addressed. The perpetrator, the onus is on the perpetrator not to commit sexual harassment or exploitation or abuse. Alcohol
Yeah,
is not a defense.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think you've addressed another question. Somebody was asking, how do you report when you have observed, not that you're the victim or you're the perpetrator, but if you have observed? I've noticed you mentioned that in your policies, you are actually as guilty if you don't say anything and you've observed. So what's the procedure?
We have, and so some agencies have their own helplines or hotlines that you can report to, but there is an overall helpline that you can either send an email, send a text, where agencies, some UN agencies, for instance, are providing relief food or they're working in the field. There's also community-based complaint mechanisms, which are more accessible for local reporting. So you're not now trying to email somebody in New York, that this is happening in, say, Kakuma, for instance, just as an example. There are community-based complaint mechanisms because we recognize that you'll not always be able, especially if, say you're a non-UN staffer, you may not even know that this that there is a procedure. But the community-based complaint mechanisms give you an avenue to report. The issue of you having to report if you think, you're not too sure, but you think, is to ensure that we don't create a culture of silence around this behavior. The bystander effect. You know how in Kenya or anywhere we look and say, yeah, it's happening, and you just keep quiet. It's to make sure that that culture is nipped in the bud, and it doesn't allow these situations to thrive.
Yeah. So another great question is, how about when a lady puts their breast half out and they're in offices? Doesn't this result to sexual harassment to men in the office, given that men will be uncomfortable with such breast exposure at work?
Again, I want to say that the onus is on if I walk around bare-breasted, and if somebody's walking around bare-breasted and that is and you inappropriately touch them and they clearly tell you that's unwelcome conduct, really it comes down to that the person still finds it as unwelcome conduct. I think we have to stop the idea of there are situations where there are no situations where sexual harassment or exploitation or abuse is permitted, or that there is excuses. I think again, it would go back to the issue of dress code. I think I saw somebody comment and say we need a strict dress code. We have to be very careful with some of those statements because they are also used to police, and particularly to police women. And that's a very slippery slope. So we have to also be careful with how we're handling that. Yes, you can have a dress code that says, as a nurse, you need to wear X. As a doctor, wear your white coat so that we know you're a doctor and you're not Raya. We know if we need help, we come to you. But I would say that you can talk about reasonable dressing, dress code, but I would not talk about policing people's dress code. I do not think whether somebody has exposed their cleavage should be an excuse for sexual harassment, and it's not. I don't think in a court of law you're going to get away with that.
No, I believe the person was phrasing the question as they feel uncomfortable.
That is contributing.
Yeah, no. They're not going to harass that person, but however, they feel uncomfortable, like they feel like this person is making sexual advances.
Then that needs to be addressed with your manager, that you need to raise this issue in the right forum and say, I think so-and-so's dressing is provocative, it's inappropriate, I'm uncomfortable. Does it constitute sexual harassment? If a person is in your face, whether it's with their breast or with their pelvis, that is sexual harassment. It's unwelcome conduct. If they're walking around with really low cleavage, or they are every so often touching their genitals or whatever, and they are not aware that they're causing offense, that's where maybe an informal route through a manager, through HR, can call this person to the side and say, in this institution, this is our dress code. In this institution, there's certain behaviors or gestures that you may not be aware, but they're causing offense. So just be aware and stop it. So you already begin that conversation to stop the process, to stop the behavior. If the person then obviously is continuing, walking around still with their cleavage, offending people, somebody else is walking around, adjusting their genitals right in front of people who have already said they find it uncomfortable, then it needs to be escalated into this conversation that this is moving on to sexual harassment, because it's unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. Yeah.
Yes. There's a question that I had seen regarding WhatsApp group, and I feel like it's a common thing. So, what if people put unwelcomed or sexual related things on WhatsApp? How do you tackle that?
I'm trying to scroll back to Dan's slide where he actually talked about that, where you see examples of sexual harassment, sharing or displaying sexually inappropriate images or videos in any format. I think that answers that question.
Yeah, and I think that should be even easier to have an evidence against, in case somebody's looking, in case anybody is looking for evidence.
And you can leave the group. Unfortunately, if it's a group maybe you rely on for work information, that can also, and this is again why we're saying sexual harassment makes it difficult for people to do their work. Maybe it's a group where you receive updates on work stuff, but now somebody's using it to send these inappropriate sexual images. So you're thinking, if I leave, then I'll miss out on the important the important updates. But I believe even within the government, there was a law or something around WhatsApp groups. I don't know whether that came to pass, whether it was more of a policy directive and less of a law. That there's a certain expectation of responsibility when you're the administrator of a WhatsApp group. So you also want to maybe address that. I think it's more common than we think, actually.
Yeah, it is. A question, can being single be a vulnerability to GBV? I don't know, what's your experience, Dan? Do you normally see a lot of single people reporting gender-based violence? I think that's the niche of the question.
I don't know what's the intention of this, but being single is not, should not, because you are as an individual, you have your own values, and should not make you be more vulnerable, and also should not be exposed you to that extent, because society, even yourself, you need to just have that self-control on yourself.
I believe we clearly need the training should clearly state the matter of indecent dressing, because a lot of questions are regarding to that. Maybe you can share the link on the training which is available on your platform so that we can address such issues. Is that possible?
Indecent dressing, or on
Is that topic covered? Because majority of the question is on indecent dressing, provoking. It seems like people need more sensitization on that.
What I'm curious.
I say something about sorry.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yes,
think
continue.
what the training does address is, issues of power and how we exert it. I believe that it has a number of scenarios. There may be scenarios about even cultural context. Some cultural context, people are they kiss on the cheeks. You enter the office, people kiss you on the cheeks, for instance. And in others, you maybe leave that culture and go to a place where you keep your kissing to yourself. We don't kiss, we don't touch. There's distinct divisions in how men and women interact in public. So it's all about cultural relativity, but also cultural sensitivity. And that's why I'm a bit curious about the question around indecent dressing, because if you go, for instance, to the island nations, it's hot, it's in the beach, you'll find, for instance, people wear shorts a lot. Now, if you go to, say, Nairobi, you'll not see many people walking around just in shorts, like adults, even men, rarely. So is that indecent dressing? So I think we need to also contextualize what you call indecent dressing, what I call indecent dressing, and perhaps bring this question back again to how do I exert my power in different situations, in work situations? How do I ensure that I am not perpetrating sexual harassment? Just put the indecent dressing aside for a minute, and just think through the issues of what about our work culture is encouraging or allows sexual harassment to prevail, and what can I do as an individual? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe I allow
Just-
one person to speak after done. Festus Kikuva, you may unmute after the comment. Yes, continue.
Yes, I just want to issue of the dressing, especially in the workplace. Most of our policies, even for the HR, you may find that it is included, even including the public service. But very few circumstances are we instructed or are we told how to dress. Even people probably more concerned with how to work and what is my pay and the kind of environment that you live in. So maybe you just need to make this come out clearly, and then if at all there's any modification that needs to be done, because some of those laws probably were done long time ago, and then people just be made aware. And that also goes together with the issue, what we have just talked in the topic that we're discussing now, sexual harassment. That it needs to come out, and the more awareness needs to be made, and therefore issues of dressing will come out strongly in that sense.
Okay. Thank you. Festus, you may speak.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, how are you?
We're doing well. I hope you're well as well.
Okay, I was asking, what if you're in a private facility and you are, let's say, harassed by your boss, maybe you do not want to lose your job, how can you advise someone on that? Hello.
We give Wangeshi the chance.
Is that
Wangeshi? Sorry.
Thank you, Festus, for that question.
I think one of the things, maybe if I just may go first, maybe others follow, is that one issue of the fear of loss of income, and therefore in this case you're losing a job, fear of the loss of job. So would you have to preserve a job? I think you still your right to make that complaint, because sometimes when we bury such kind of issues, it ends up just becoming much more and probably gives the other person more power to continue. As Nyabura was giving the presentation and gave examples of some of the incidences that have occurred either within the UN or even outside, some of those bosses end up being sacked, and it becomes now a prohibitive nature, because they need to be responsible, need to identify, you need to respond, you need to report the cases, and those things need to be reported immediately and actions will be taken. So sometimes the fear which makes us hide them, and also sometimes also issues of stigma, that if you report, people will stigmatize you, or this is what happens. So I think this should be taken seriously, and therefore, as one of the mitigating factors, action being taken against the perpetrator.
Any other panelists who might want to, yeah. But I think you've addressed it very well. You can report your superior. I believe there's HR. Dr. Margaret has also given you the alternative of going to a GBV center. You have many choices, but the reality is you also have to weigh the risk of losing your job. It's the sad reality, but it's I think it's a worth risk if the perpetrator is like that. So for me, my other question would be, this is directly to Nyambura. Are the policies the same? Do they handle, like, let's say if the CEO is the one who is doing the sexual harassment, does it handle the case the same way as a junior employee? And do we normally have an internal body, or is it an external body who would do the investigations? What's the ideal?
I think on the, and I've lost my play. Oh, here I'm back again. I think the point I was making, there was a point I made about the policy and procedures being applicable to those who are likely to be sexually harassed, as well as those who could perpetrate sexual harassment. So in the case of the UN, what happened was where we saw allegations against pretty senior members of staff, and an exposure of our procedures as not being as robust as we had thought they were, there was an effort to even come up with a model policy on sexual harassment to enable agencies to review the policies that they had in place. So it's not that the policies weren't there, they were there, but they were not robust enough to deal, for instance, when it is somebody so high up in the food chain that you don't even, by the time someone is bringing an allegation, the bravery that comes with that is you can't even speak of it. So the policies need to be able to protect a cleaner, for instance. I'll just give that example. A cleaner who is making allegations that the executive director or the CEO or manager X has sexually harassed them. Your policies need to be that robust. The sense I'm getting also, Amina, is that there doesn't seem to be clarity on what policies exist. And I think it's important really to, maybe as a follow-up to this, to give people even lists of what policies they need to reference, whether it's the Ethics Act. I believe I saw someone say that most ministries have a gender policy, within which sometimes you'll find they have a line or two on sexual harassment. I think this needs to be dug out for Ministry of Health so that everybody on the call knows what they're making reference to. But to your question, does the policy apply to everybody when it comes to sexual harassment within the UN? Yes, it does. Can you be investigated? Even the head of the UN, yes, you can be investigated.
No, I'm asking if they use the same procedure, like is it the same? You use the same method you would use to investigate a junior employee and a senior employee.
It's the same method. It's the same reporting
and it's
channel.
efficient.
Efficient, I will not comment on that because I believe it's not a perfect system, but in terms of
It's a system.
It's a system.
It's better than nothing.
It's better than nothing. We're increasing awareness. That's part of the work Dan and I do in our network, is to increase awareness among staff members that this is how you report should it happen. This is what is available to you, because unless people know it exists and which procedure to follow, they'll not use it. Yeah.
So another aspect and another ripple effect is you'd find majority of male mentors, especially after the hashtag #MeToo, being very reserved in mentoring young female people in the same profession and what have you. Because you're at policy level, how are you addressing such concerns?
A good point, that I think we are more likely to see men being very careful how, especially where it's men in positions of power, mentoring. I think again the whole idea of training staff members of all levels, including managers, including heads of agencies, on what is sexual harassment, is so that you can recognize when it is happening. You can recognize and ensure that the conditions that allow sexual harassment to happen are not present. And of course, we cannot police. We cannot. People will feel scared. People will feel a bit concerned. Will people think I'm sexually harassing this person? But if it's a purely mentorship relationship, you have nothing to fear. Yeah. There are, again, let me just say, the procedures are very clear. You don't bring fake allegations. There's a process of investigation. And I think when you have a robust policy, it protects you from fake allegations, and it gives people confidence to engage, as colleague to colleague or mentor to mentee, etc. Yeah. But yes, we do know, I do know someone, a male colleague, a male senior person who said, yeah, you know what? We all now have to be super careful. And I thought, yeah, it's true. But if it means we are all safer, and if we all know this is the line not to cross, if that makes us feel safer at the workplace, I'm all for it. But we have all a responsibility to create that safe environment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I can see the time is up. I can't thank you enough for the beautiful and very informative session that we've had. I believe you've started a very powerful discussion in Kenya and amongst healthcare workers, amongst all government institutions, to take up the issue of sexual exploitation very seriously. Maybe for me, as a recap, the most important take-home message is the difference between unwelcome gesture together with consent. As in, for the viewers who have just joined in, biggest difference right now is unwelcomed jokes, unwelcome touching, unwelcomed everything, not just consent, because you can be in a position of power. Somebody gives you a yes, and it's not an actual yes. So thank you very much, all panelists, and thank you all for joining in. I'm very sorry we weren't able to address all questions. Maybe next time. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Unless there's any other comment from or concern from the panelists.
Dr. Amina, next
Yes.
week we'll have a presentation by Dr. Wafula on gender-based violence, the next session.
So it will be like a series. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
We'll be more than happy to have you. So thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Kinuthia, for arranging this. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Good evening. Thank you.